Hi, this is Brian Schiff, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the NAFI Briefing Room, where we've got Tom Turner, the Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society Air Safety Foundation. And we're going to talk about a continuation discussion of the Power Off 180 that I had with Joey Johnson a couple weeks ago. Tom, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Thanks for having me here. You're right. I watched that, your earlier edition with Joey with great interest because I don't do a lot of certificate and ratings training. However, I do type-specific pilot training in Beech airplanes. And one of the items that we've talked among our instructors about introducing or reintroducing to our syllabus is the Power Off 180 accuracy approach and landing. So suddenly your seminar came up, and I thought, well, this is going to be excellent information for me right now. And that led to a bunch of questions that I had, and we shared together about how do I look at this from the instructor standpoint? How do I get better at teaching the Power Off 180? So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today.
Right, and that's great. We had that discussion from a DPE's perspective, and now I think we can add a lot to that from an instructor's point of view. He told us basically where students are failing on that, and that it is one of the most commonly failed maneuvers. But I think you bring another perspective that's very important, and that is advanced training for people of specific airplanes, or Bonanzas, or Barons in that case, where it's not just to pass the Checkride, but this is kind of like, hey, how do I set this thing down in a field if I actually had a real emergency with no power? And this is a good maneuver to train, to practice, and be familiar with. So there's a lot of advice, not only for passing the Checkride, but for practicing for a hopefully unlikely emergency.
Yeah, and we actually, in our Beechcraft Pilot Proficiency Program, we have a demonstration we do with our customers of power off descent, a spiral down over the airport. Now, we don't do the commercial steep spiral thing. We do a gradual spiral down, but the entire purpose of this spiral is to teach them to get into position opposite their intended touchdown spot at an altitude where they can continue in what is essentially the Power Off 180 maneuver to a touchdown. So my interest in learning more about this is how do we get better, I personally, and how do we collectively get better at teaching this in the context of an engine failure landing.
Exactly, and I think that's a good point, is to get to that position, I think referred to as the key position, where you're downwind of beam the numbers at a certain altitude.
Right.
And then you just perform the maneuver that you've trained for, the one that we're discussing right now. And so you just get to that point by circling and ending up at that key position at a certain altitude. And then you go on from there and perform the maneuver that we're talking about. Then all it is a Power Off 180. One of the things that I like to do to have my students prepare for that maneuver for the Checkride and in real life is make that their default approach procedure. If there's no traffic in your way, so if traffic permits and you're in an aircraft or you're not babying your engine because it's a turbo, make it a default, and most trainers are. Just make a power off glide from the key position, your normal approach procedure. If you have to extend downwind, well, that's different. Unravel the pattern to visualize that key position at 1.5 miles or wherever it might be, and then start the maneuver from that point. And then it becomes kind of an energy management thing.
Yeah, and I remember doing this, well, I barely remember because it's been 32 years, but I remember doing this in a 182 RG back when I was working on a commercial in my CFI. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics, but I have played around with it in a Beech Bonanza recently, and found that the concept is sound. Practice this regularly.
Yeah.
But in practice, it doesn't work out quite so well in this airplane because, among other things, if you are at normal traffic pattern height and even a little tight on a downwind approach, if you extend the landing gear at least, and we can talk about that later if you want, that was one of my questions, there's no way that you can glide from the high key position and make it to the runway. In a training airplane, and especially now since with the changes of the rules about complex aircraft, most pilots will probably be taking their practical test in a fixed gear airplane, and in some cases, you know, Diamonds and Cirruses, an airplane that has a a very, very good glide ratio compared to others. It might be a lot easier, but this thing, when you slow it to, you get it on glide speed with the power off and the gear down, even with the flaps up, it's a sinker. You and Joey talked about this in the earlier briefing room item, and actually the depiction in the airplane flying handbook of the procedure, the diagram, shows the pattern to be essentially a squared off normal VFR traffic pattern. And that doesn't work in the airplanes I fly.
Right.
If I don't make a essentially continuous curving turn at best glide speed, and we'll come back to altitude in a minute, if I don't make a continuous curving turn, I cannot make it. And if I were to try to extend out onto a normal pattern like this, it just wouldn't work.
Right.
I can't put out any flaps at all until I'm on very short final. But I'll tell you a little bit, because after viewing your program, I took the plane up and experimented a little bit.
Sure.
It inspired me to go out and let's try this. Let's practice this. So the first thing I did was I flew a normal VFR traffic pattern. I fly pretty tight patterns anyhow compared to a lot of folks. But I flew a normal VFR traffic pattern. And coincidentally, the way we fly that, it has us just about at best glide speed for the aircraft. And I did it at normal traffic pattern height. So I pulled the throttle all the way back to idle, the gear horn's going beep, beep, beep. So I extended the landing gear, because I don't want to forget that, and found that I'm immediately adding about 500 foot per minute to the glide ratio of the aircraft because of the gear extension. And it took a very essentially continuous, nearly steep bank turn to be able to turn and align with the runway. And I wasn't going to make it. And I tried it twice that way. There was no way I could do it. I tried it then from, instead of 1,000 feet up, I tried it from 1,300 feet up, and it's still really sketchy. I found to be consistent with it, I had to start the maneuver 1,500 feet above ground level, which is exactly what we teach in our BPPP system at the end of that spiral down over the airport, to be at high key at 1,500 feet. So that works in these airplanes. I guess my point for this is that anyone who's instructing this maneuver will need to, be a little bit flexible with the selection of altitude, right, based on that specific airplane's characteristics, and also probably, though, actually the way that I teach it, the way we teach it, that spiral maneuver, I tell people, think of it as being a turn around a point, with that point being your intended touchdown spot.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. You also mentioned the landing gear, and I noticed that's, excuse me, a bit of a question that other people have answered. So how do you mitigate not forgetting to put the gear down if you want to delay that? Because I don't think I'd want to put it down right away. When I do these and teach these maneuvers, the power off 180, it's typically managing your drag. You don't have an engine, so we have to increase drag at a certain rate. So when do you put the gear down, and how do you mitigate not forgetting?
Yeah, well, I did do that a while back. I was practicing this several months ago as well. And I tried it one time. So, I'm going to see what the characteristics are like if I leave the gear up until short final. And the nice thing is that the airplanes I'm flying has an electric gear system, and the gear goes down in about 4.5 seconds. So it's, and it's it. So it goes down very rapidly. So it's something you can do right away. But what I did, now, as an aside, you may know that I've spent a good portion of my 30-year career as a flight instructor studying the problem of gear up landings.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of research on that, written quite a bit about them, not just in the types of airplanes I fly, but all retractable gear piston airplanes. And there are some very definite patterns that ensue. One of them is that approximately half of all reported gear up landings happen during the conduct of dual flight instruction.
Wow.
And I think that's because by nature, we instructors provide unusual and distracting scenarios to our students.
That's a good
Something
point.
Different from what is normal.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, how do I mitigate that? And what I did, flying solo in this airplane, is when I pulled the power and began my my turn around a landing point, basically, I was shouting out loud to myself, the gear is still up. The gear is still up all of the way around. And I decided that, yeah, I could probably do it consistently from pattern height that way if I wanted to, but knowing the history and not wanting to completely fail one of my students one day by us both forgetting it, I'd rather myself practice it from a higher altitude with the gear out, with the gear down.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I usually do something like, if my hand is on the throttle, I'll put a finger out, and that's like tying a ribbon around my finger or something. Or if there are two things I need to do before landing and they're holding off, I'll have two fingers
That makes sense.
And but sometimes it'll be on short final. Why is my finger out again? Oh, the gear.
Yeah, exactly. The good news is that at idle power, most retractable gear airplanes will have a gear warning horn blaring at you. Beep, beep, beep. The bad news is we tend to tune it out.
Yeah, that distraction usually makes us forget the gear.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the other thing that, we can use to manage is, and I think very important that a lot of people don't realize, is the propeller RPM in a complex airplane. Like you said, though, many applicants for the commercial are no longer doing their check rides in a complex airplane because they don't have to.
Right.
But the maneuvers still should be taught in the event that you have to make an emergency landing in such an airplane. So it's a very important consideration. What do you do? What do you teach students to do with the propeller control in such a maneuver?
Well, again, from a risk management standpoint, we generally just leave the propeller in our glide position, and in our forward position during the glide. Now, we do that for a couple of different reasons, but primarily it's because we want to have the power immediately available should we have to go around out of the maneuver.
Right.
Now, I know a number of instructors who have taught at Kansas State University, and for many years they used Bonanzas as their complex trainers, and I have some of their training materials, and they all, what they say in their program was they would start it from traffic pattern height, but put the gear down right away and go ahead and pull the prop to the low RPM position. There's nothing really, there's nothing really wrong with that. It's really disconcerting for an airplane owner to suddenly have their propeller in the low RPM position when they're very close to the ground. And so I would rather start it at 1,500 feet with the gear down and the prop forward for a practice maneuver.
Yeah.
And it also coincides precisely with what we teach for the spiral down from altitude, engine out into the high key position. I personally do that so that we've got the gear down because of the distraction value, and we've got the propeller fully forward, so that we essentially, assuming that we've put the mixture forward as appropriate for the landing, we have essentially restored single power lever control to this aircraft. And all we have to do is push the black throttle, the black handle in to make it go if we have to. So that's how I mitigate it.
I like the idea of doing that as well, but for a little bit different reason. I do it mostly complex Cessnas, so 210s and 182s or Cutlass RGs, and the gear doesn't make that big a difference. It's not worth learning how to do it to be flying a pattern with the gear down and adding that degree of risk. I think getting the gear down is important. But as far as the propeller control goes, I like to demonstrate the almost feeling of thrust that a pilot will feel when you pull that propeller back to a low RPM. But also, we have a lot of drag we can add to this whole thing. We can add flaps, we can slip, we can do all kinds of adding of drag, but there's one thing you can keep in your hip pocket is that propeller as a means of, okay, I'm going to take away some drag, or in effect add thrust. And that's the only way we can correct in that direction. So if you see yourself unusually low, you're not going to make it, that's a kind of like a feather in an arrow in your quiver that you can use.
We actually demonstrate that as well up at higher altitude usually, although as the situation arises, we do that. I do that anyhow, close to the ground in what is essentially the power off 180 maneuver. Using it, the way I describe it, is use it as a speed brake, just like you use speed brakes at a sailplane.
Sure.
Push the handle in and it slows down, pull the handle back and it speeds up, or really more appropriately, it adds drag, reduces drag.
Right.
A
And I think,
lot of, go ahead.
yeah, when I got my glider rating, they showed us how to modulate, was
Yeah.
taught how to modulate the speed brake. So when you start your descent from a key position, you put it at 50%. You're going to have it there no matter what. And then you just use it like a throttle. If you're too low and you need to add power, well, you push forward and that stows the speed brakes.
Yeah.
If you're too high and you need to reduce power, you kind of pretend it's a throttle, pull back on it, and that extends the speed brakes and adds more drag, but you're modulating that. I also like to do the same thing with a slip. Just enter a real mild slip and then modulate it from there. If you are too low, come out of the slip a little bit. If you're too high, increase the slip.
I had a Cessna 120 for a long time. I'm a slipper. Yeah, I like to slip as well. Do you play around in the sailplane, especially? Do you play around with changes in indicated airspeed during the maneuver to modulate altitude?
I do, and I think it's important to understand that, you know, we teach to do this at best glide speed, and that's going to get you as far as you can. So yeah, if you need to get down, you can go slower or faster. Either is theoretically going to change your drag, right? And
exactly
give you a steeper glide path. The caution here is that you don't want to get to the threshold at VREF plus 20 or 30 and then be floating forever, because the idea of the power off accuracy landing is to touch down at a certain point or within 200 feet of that point. So you don't want to be too hot. Do you use that, different airspeeds?
Would it work better in this maneuver, instead of flying at best glide, to fly an even tighter turn and fly it at the least rate of descent and come down at the steeper angle, but without the forward distance? And I learned very rapidly that no, you need distance, because there's a lot of, even in a continuous turn, you cover a lot of territory making that arc back to the runway. So that didn't work. But we do show that, okay, you're a little higher than you want to be. Well, slow it down just to, slow it down 10 knots and you'll come down at a slightly steeper angle. And as soon as you get back to where you want to be, put it back to where the pitch attitude you want, and get your speed back.
Yeah, great advice. And I always teach as a matter of habit, come in high, you've got plenty of ways to add drag and get down. And you can't be afraid of the slip. Pilots need to be able to do the forward slip and not be afraid of that, because it's an easy way to make your approach steeper. And if you're doing a normal light slip, you come out of it, that adds a little bit of added glide performance as well. You mentioned the continuous radius to final. I think UND or Embry-Riddle, some of the colleges in the FAA were looking at doing that and implementing it, which makes great sense. And you just change your radius of turn for the energy you need to dissipate, which is actually, I believe, how the Space Shuttle Orbiter comes back down, goes to a certain place on final, and the computer calculates a cone. So the higher it is, the larger the radius and the more ground to cover, which is a concept that can work. But for students in this scenario, doing the power off 180, I have them roll out on a base and immediately ask, how do I look? And now you've got some geometry to play with. And if you look really high, you can angle out to a longer final. And if you look really low, you can angle in. You can go straight for the numbers if you have to, but you can modulate that base leg, the angle of the base leg, to accommodate for your altitude.
That makes sense. And one of the other mitigations I'm always concerned about is the fact that AOPA's data tell us, and it's based on NTSB data, that the vast majority of mid-air collisions occur within 400 feet of the ground on final approach. So if I'm in a continual turning, first off, if I'm doing this maneuver, I have to be cautious that all of my attention is looking out the side window, trying to keep that spot in the runway in sight.
Yeah.
And secondly, if in a low-wing airplane I'm in a left-hand turn, well, it could have work in a right-hand turn either. If I'm a continuous turn to the runway, I am with my wing blocking my vision of somebody coming in on a longer final, as more conventional final approach. Yeah. So I do actually level the wings momentarily to clear the area, and that's I like your phrase of how does it look. I'm going to incorporate that.
Yeah, all my students hear that. Even my students who are airline pilots now, when they turn base on a visual approach in their airliners, they still hear me asking, "How do you look?" Yeah. That question always on base leg is a good one to ask, and then you can make changes from there. But I really like bringing in the traffic collision avoidance. That's very important, and something that I believe that I've neglected in this, because the pilot gets focused and tunnel visioned on the task at hand and may forget to look for traffic.
Great. Brian, it sounds like you've done this a lot more recently than I have. What are some of the most common mistakes you see, and how can I fix it when I mess up?
Well, I think I am going to defer to the airplane flying handbook, and I'll share this here. The common mistakes that I'm seeing are pretty much the same thing that are in the airplane flying handbook, and these are the common errors. And which is a great change that they've made to this book, is that in a lot of the maneuvers, they show the common errors, which are great to study. But the downwind leg being too far from the runway or landing area. And I think this, again, these habits should be instilled for those instructors who are watching this. Instill these habits in your students as soon as you can, as a primary part of their flight training, to keep them close enough to the runway to consider that if the engine fails, you can glide. So keep the downwind kind of close to the runway and do it the same way every time. An overextension of the downwind leg resulting from a tailwind, we always land into the wind, right? So it stands to reason we're going to have a tailwind on the downwind, which is, I guess, why they named it that. So I see students going too far downwind, and then once you get too far away, you can't do anything about it. It's over. Again, coming in high is the way to go on this maneuver. It's easier to try to get down. There are more tools to implement than there are to try to extend your glide. Then, of course, the inadequate compensation for wind drift on the base leg. If you have a quartering crosswind to the runway for landing, you could have a tailwind or a headwind on base, and that is something I don't see students compensating for, and they really need to. You need to think, okay, the wind is from my tail on this crosswind, so I need to turn earlier, or just be thinking about it and know how you're going to compensate for that. And then the other thing, the next is skidding turns to increase gliding distance. I will see students, and this is very dangerous, you know, they got a tailwind on base, they didn't compensate for it, and they're going to overshoot the final. And this is where it's tempting to be, well, if I bank too much, I'm going to lose all that glide performance. So instead of banking, I'm going to feed in that rudder to point myself to the runway. And now you've got a skidding turn, which, as we know, is a recipe for disaster.
Right. And in a lot of aircraft, the best glide speed is very close to, or fairly close to a stalling speed in the airplane too. So, you know, a lot of training.
Especially, yeah, in a steep turn.
Glide at a much lower speed than maybe what I'm used to.
Exactly. So I think if you're going to make a steeper turn, I would rather see a student or pilot, in that matter, make a steeper turn, but maybe not load the nose. So don't pull back in the turn, let the nose drop and keep it at a 1G turn, and you're not going to increase the stall speed so much. I would much rather see a 1G steep turn descending than I would speeding in that rudder and skidding around the final.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then the landing gear, failure to lower landing gear in retractable gear airplanes, that's another common error, and we talked about that in some ways to mitigate that.
Yeah.
And then attempting to stretch the glide in an undershoot, and it's human nature to stretch a glide by pulling back, and you have got to be very disciplined about that best glide speed, and that can vary for the airplane you're in. As you know, in the Bonanzas and the Barons and the King Air, for that matter, you're going to have a much different glide speed depending on the weight of the aircraft. Even the 210 has a wide range of glide speeds. So know the best glide speed for your weight anytime you're flying the airplane, whether you're doing these maneuvers or not.
That's right. The published speeds are at maximum gross weight, and then they decrease from there.
Exactly. And that's important for instructors to point out. And then premature flap extension and landing gear extension. We talked about the gear. I think premature on that is not a bad thing, but flaps is. And I'm often asked, and I'd like your take on this, if I put too much flaps in and I see I'm not going to make it, can I retract the flaps?
You can. I don't know that it would respond quickly enough that it would solve your problem. Remember, the reason we have flaps in an airplane in the first place is so that we can descend at a steeper angle. And they were arguably an improvement over having to slip the airplane. And we don't want to slip it. We don't want to steepen the angle. So as this list suggests, we want to wait until we are really essentially almost over our landing surface before we extend any flaps, unless you find yourself very, very high out there. I would rather use your what seems to be your preferred technique. I would rather use a slip to correct for being high on glide path on final in this maneuver than I would put out flaps. I'd be really inclined, and in much of my practice, I've not used any flaps at all and made a zero flap landing out of it.
I agree. I think that's perfectly fine. The flaps are something to keep in your hip pocket for when you screw up and you're too high, and plan the zero flap landing. I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I'm looking at the ACS for this maneuver, and there's no statement about use of flaps or requirement of using flaps, other than in the context of risk mitigation to determine whether you should be using that at all.
Right, and I just put it on the screen.
Oh, there we go. Good.
Yeah, and the important part is to plan a flight path and use the flaps as a tool. Use them at the end to get down if you need it. If you don't, then don't put them down. The first notch of flaps usually is mostly lift, and I really don't have a problem with that going on earlier on. But the later flaps selections, I think, should be delayed because they're more drag than lift. And when you do retract them, you're going to initially lose enough lift. You better have enough altitude to play with that you're going to have it initially.
Yeah, that's right. You might, yeah, that's right. You might have a steady state of improved glide performance, but you're going to have a transitory phase where there may be even worse performance until it enters that steady state.
And you get that sinker, but also that transitory phase of extension can also help you at the last minute. If you're going to fall short of your mark, you can just
there you go.
Flaps down there and get a little lift and get
a little buoy out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen that also. But in any event, that's the thing while we're looking at this, it's the proper pitch attitudes. In other words, they don't want you touching down on your nose first in a tricycle aircraft. You want to touch down on your mains in the normal landing attitude within 200 feet or beyond the specified point. So I think of importance is to look at, okay, I use a precision runway to try and teach this. And I use the touchdown markers, or the thick white ones that are 1,000 feet down. Typically, if you find an airport with the precision markings like this, there's not a lot of aircraft in the pattern there. And I found that you can typically get a lot of pattern work done there in between IFR arrivals, that is. And if you can find a precision runway to use, I tell my students to use the beginning of that touchdown zone marker, which is the second one down the runway. And I think I have those touchdown zone markers themselves are 150 feet long.
Right.
So if you aim for the beginning of that paint and don't touch down before it, but don't touch down after the end of the paint, you're giving a 150-foot window. And if you can do that, then you certainly can make the 200-foot window.
Absolutely.
So I like to use these markings for training in this maneuver for the Checkride.
And I do as well. We do have around here, we have several non-towered airports that have precision approaches and markings. And so that's really handy to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, and that's good advice.
Is the purpose of this maneuver, one, to teach engine failures in the traffic pattern, two, to teach it the way I do, which is the conclusion of an engine failure at altitude and setting yourself up for an engine out landing? Or three, philosophically, is it, and I sometimes jokingly refer to these as Checkride circus tricks, is it a maneuver we learn for the purpose of being able to demonstrate our ability to perform that maneuver? And if it is seen by an examiner or an instructor as a maneuver in its own right, a Checkride circus trick, something we learn to show that we know how to do that thing, then you could probably you could argue either way on what altitude you choose. If philosophically, and I'm going to ask your opinion on this in a second, if philosophically this all goes back to teaching engine failures in the traffic pattern, then I need to do it differently because I'm not in a traffic pattern when I'm teaching this maneuver. So philosophically, what do you think we're doing here?
Philosophically, I think that it's not so much, and I know what you're talking about, Checkride circus tricks, and I think I would probably refer to the Chandelle and the Lazy 8 a little bit more about that, and it's checking, how well you can divide your attention.
Oh, yeah. All that. Oh, there are valid reasons for it, but yes.
Yeah, absolutely. But this maneuver in particular, I think of the first two that you mentioned. One is to handle an engine failure in the pattern, but more importantly, I think, and more commonly, what are the odds your engine's going to fail right downwind of beam the numbers? Okay. I think more commonly, you're going to be cruising somewhere, something happens, you lose your engine, And you want to get to that key position and know that, hey, there's a field. I know that I can get to yes, I can get to that field, and gliding to that field is just half the battle,
Right.
probably less than half the battle. The big part of that battle is doing this maneuver right here, getting to a position where you know you can not only turn and fly a pattern and land in that field, but to touch down in the beginning part of that field so as to roll out. It's no good if you make to the field and then touch down at the end of it,
Right.
and then go into the wall. Like if you're trying to land in a football field and that's all you've got around, you don't want to touch down in your end zone.
Yeah.
You want to touch down at the beginning.
That's right.
And I think this maneuver really prepares a pilot for knowing the airplane well enough to do such a thing. And that's why I think it should be practiced quite a bit. And we do the engine failures at altitudes. We spring these on our students all the time. And then when they get to this key position, now this is, okay, we want to see if you would have made it. Is your approach such that you would touch down in the early parts of that field that you chose? And did you modify it? And did you plan for that? So I think demonstrating that to an examiner on a check ride is showing that if I lose an engine at altitude, I can be in command of this airplane enough to get it, not only get it to the field, but to fly a pattern and land without blowing the whole thing after that.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I agree with you. That's the way I look at it. So we're in agreement here. Something I've said for a very long time: engine failures don't kill pilots. Poorly planned glides or just bad luck kill pilots.
Right.
You know, sometimes you just have no options, but more often than not, it's a poorly planned glide. And at least in the Beech piston airplanes that I've studied for 30 years now, very, very commonly, and I see it in other makes and models as well, very, very commonly when there's been an engine failure accident, the airplane ends up almost making it to a good touchdown zone, or as you said, overshooting it and going into the trees or something at the far end. Yeah. So practicing this maneuver, the way I look at it anyhow, practicing this maneuver in the context of the final 1,500 feet of an engine failure in flight makes a lot of sense. Right. There are other reasons to do it. There are check ride reasons to do it. There are practice. I mean, if you can do this maneuver, if you can get a student pilot to do this even before a private exam, at least introduce this concept, I think that you would make short field landings a lot easier. This would be a little harder than a short field landing. So you take them a little beyond that and you back up a little bit. Now you've got the power to play with. Let's make a short field landing.
Yeah. Well, I got news for you. Every one of my students pre-solo can do this maneuver.
Cool.
Because it's power off of beam the numbers, and that's the law of primacy. That's the first thing they teach. It's not a stabilized approach. So anyway, I think we had a good talk, good discussion on this. Anything else you want to add?
No, this has been fantastic, Brian. Thank you. It's given me a lot to work with because I've been out of the practice of teaching commercial pilot applicants for far too many years. And now that I'm thinking about doing it again, your earlier presentation with Mr. Johnson, and now this discussion here has really given me a lot to work with. So I really appreciate it.
Great. And it's been good for me as well. When instructors get together and talk, I think it's very valuable for both the instructors, and I hope that anybody watching this gets something out of it as well. And if there's anything to contribute, please feel free to mark in the comments so that anybody else who watches this can read your comments on that as well. So again, Tom, thanks for joining. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
All right. Take care.